Before I get started today, I just wanted to reiterate my thoughts and feelings about this subject. Obviously, I am very biased towards the idea of evolution. However, I don't have any problem with religion nor religious people. My issue is with the idea of intelligent design being a scientific theory. Once again, this is the second of my two-part video series, mini-series, on the arguments between intelligent design and evolution. And like I said in my last video about intelligent design in the science classroom and what I thought about that, this is primarily going to be looking at the evidence for both of them and, more importantly, looking at the contradictions between them as well as the arguments against them. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of the issues that evolution has, or that intelligent design proponents and creationists have pointed out in evolution that supposedly disprove it. The first and most commonly cited one is regarding complex structures. How are complex structures evolved over the course of time? Okay, this is actually based off of a quote from Darwin. All right. The second one is a general lack of scientific evidence. And as part of that, evolution is becoming a religion. I mentioned that in my last video as well, but that's essentially the argument, is that there's no scientific evidence for evolution, and or the scientific evidence is contradictory to itself, etc., etc. Okay? The third thing is that it's not falsifiable. You can't disprove evolution, therefore it is not done by the scientific method. One of the biggest parts of the scientific method is that if you're doing a test where the only answer is yes, then it's not science. Just like if the only answer is no, it's not science. You have to be able to ask a yes or no question and get either answer. So if it's not falsifiable, then it's not science. Okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each one of those a little bit more in depth. Right? The first one, like I said, is complex structures. Right? So this actually started with an often misquoted passage from Darwin's On the Origin of Species, from when he first wrote it. And there were a couple of parts of this where, namely, he was talking about the eye. And in this case, the quote that is often represented is, "To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd to the highest possible degree." If you were to read that, then obviously you would think, oh wow, that means that clearly the eye must have been designed by a creator and or intelligent design, whatever it happens to be. But the problem is, that's where most of the quotes stop. Darwin actually went on in his book On the Origin of Species and talked more and more and more about how the eye could have evolved. And now we know a great deal more about how the eye works and also where it could have come from. So if you think about it, we know about things like cyanobacteria, protozoa, all these kinds of things, planarians, which we all work in science class, right? All of these different cells have very basic photoreceptors. And if you can think of that, it's just you're sitting down on the ground and there's light. You know there's light, you don't know where it's coming from. Okay? That is the eye at its most basic. Okay? After that, you think if you've got a primitive being that can now determine the direction of the light, that's an advantage, because the whole point of evolution is it's evolution by natural selection. If an organism has a slight advantage over its fellow organisms, that one is more likely to go on and make progeny. Okay? So if you have an organism that can now see, quote unquote, see where light is coming from, the general direction, then they can either avoid it or go to it, whichever one they want to do. Right? Whereas if you've got a guy who is just sitting there and just knows that there's light around them, then they're at a disadvantage because they don't know if they're going towards or away from it. Beyond that, you can have random mutations that can then go into deeper recesses, wherein you get better and better and better at determining both the direction as well as the source, how far away it is, all of that kind of stuff. Okay? So these are just some basic ways that we can see at least the basic primitive steps for this. Some of the other things are looking at eyes of different creatures. For example, the octopus eye. If you look at an octopus eye versus a vertebrate eye, they look different. They have evolved completely separately, but they look almost the same. They are a little bit different. There are differences in blind spots and things like that. Okay? Now, I will say that this is one of the biggest arguments in favor of intelligent design, is the generation of complex organs and things of that nature, which I will talk about a little bit later on when I get to the intelligent design arguments. But for the purposes of the eye, which is one of the biggest calls against evolution, it is based on that misquote. That quote was taken out of context from Darwin's book, and therefore most people don't see that he goes on to talk about, hey, this is what could have happened eventually, okay? And you can go and eventually you can make all the biochemical processes that can then see light, quote, see light in a much better sense, and then go into seeing rods, cones, black and white, color vision, all that kind of stuff. Okay? It is certainly possible. All right? After that, like I said, the second part is a lack of scientific evidence for evolution, and as part of that, saying that it's a religion because it's a belief system that is not supported by evidence, as well as saying that a lot of the evidence is contradictory. The sad thing about this is that really neither one is true, okay? It's really unfortunate, but there is an unfortunate amount of ignorance regarding this. The vast majority of the scientific community accepts evolution by natural selection as the origin of species, the origin of life, and how it came about. And just to demonstrate this very briefly, I have with me a magazine that I get in the mail known as Science. Okay? Now, this is published by the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, okay? And this is their official magazine, Science. This particular issue is from September 9th of 2011, and this was the first real look at a new missing link in our human evolutionary chain. And in this case, it is the Australopithecus sediba, okay? There you go, Australopithecus sediba. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of the images in this. Now, keep in mind, this magazine is published every week, okay? Now, this is just one example from 1 year, from 1 week, right? And let's take a look at some of the evidence. So first, we've got some basic stuff. This is where the bones were found, things like that. And over here, we've got an example of what the cranium would have looked like with the brain inside. Okay, down at the bottom there, we see what the teeth look like, and we see what they look like in relation to human. Okay, so in this case, they look very similar. Next, we're looking at the hands and the pelvis. So for example, right there, there's a human holding the Australopithecus, the new one, holding the Australopithecus hand. And then at the bottom of the page here, we've got images from the pelvises of Australopithecus africanus on the left, and on the right, Australopithecus sediba. Note that Africanus has much larger wings on it. After that, part of this issue was that they had numerous papers, original research articles, discussing this discovery. Okay? All different sorts. In this case, this is the first one that they published in this particular issue, where they talk about the cranium. And they talk about its structure, how the brain would have fit in, all that kind of stuff. Okay? And how it's similar to human. Okay? Next is the partial pelvis. They talk about the pelvis, how it works, how it potentially could have allowed this particular Australopithecus to walk upright, all of that kind of stuff. It's full of all different measurements, tables, different charts, all that kind of stuff. Obviously a bunch of images showing what the pelvis actually looked like, everything like that. And last but certainly not least is arguably the most important thing, where it looked at the hand. Okay? One of the biggest things that separates us from other lower mammals such as mice and things of that nature is that we and the apes, chimps, all of those guys, we have opposable thumbs, and we are also much better at grasping. Okay? And what this particular article did is it looked at exactly that. It wanted to see how it could manipulate both objects as well as its hands to grasp and to move. Okay? So if you notice here, we've got an image that has the hand, and it points out all of the different structural features of the hand that would allow it to move and grasp and all of those kinds of things, much, much, much like a human does, a Homo sapien, which is what we are. Okay? There are also additional bone fragments that this particular paper looked at of various sorts, but I won't really get into that too much. Okay? They also talked, there was another paper that was published here about the foot and ankle, which was also related to the locomotion of this particular missing link. So again, that is 5 scientific papers discussing Australopithecus sediba in a single issue of a weekly published scientific magazine. Like, you can't say there's no evidence. Look at fossil records. Look at this. Look at anything. Look at, we can see microevolution. We can see bacteria and viruses evolving. We can see all this stuff. And we see similarities in embryos, how embryos develop between even reptiles and chickens and humans, much less apes and chimps. It's ludicrous. I don't get it. And the idea that it's religion, how? Evolution is not religion. It's being called, like we as evolution believers are being called evolutionists, Darwinists, all this kind of stuff, when it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work. Because it's not true. We are not religious in the sense that we believe in this scientific theory. It doesn't make any sense. Okay? Next, the argument of unfalsifiability. In other words, there is no test that would disprove evolution. This, in part, goes back to the complex structures, which is sort of the biggest overarching thing for most of these arguments, as well as one more quote from Darwin's book, where he said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Which is very true. The whole point of evolution is that it's evolution by natural selection. If these small little changes aren't being selected for and not allowing those particular organisms to then go on and generate progeny at a better efficiency rate, whatever you want to call it, then evolution would not be true. It makes perfect sense. The problem is that it's not true. Okay? We see this happening. There are a lot of ways that this could be disproven. For example, if we had not found Australopithecus sediba, if we had not found Neanderthals, if we had not found any of these missing links between us and apes, if we had not found any of these, then that would be evidence against evolution. Okay? If there was no fossil record, if there was, say, a full-grown, full-fledged Homo sapien that lived in the era of the dinosaurs, that would disprove evolution, because it would mean that humans have existed for much, much longer than evolution evidence says. All of that would be able to falsify evolution. But, for some reason, no. One of the other issues that was cited that's a little bit more on the molecular side, which I approve of, is that between us and the great apes, there is a difference of 2 chromosomes, okay? And essentially what happened, this was actually shown in a paper back in 2005, an actual scientific paper, was that our chromosome 2, I believe it was, is very similar to the 2 chromosomes that we are missing. And essentially what happened is there was an event of chromosome fusion sometime in our ancestry. And what that means is that the chromosomes that we're supposedly missing were fused with at least one other chromosome to make one new chromosome. And that was, again, a scientific paper that disproved this idea of unfalsifiability. If it had been shown that those chromosomes were not fused, then that would be evidence against evolution. And therefore, it would be shown to be falsified. Or at least there would be evidence against it. Okay? Now once again, I want to just sort of drive home the idea that the biggest thing with all of this is the complex structures. Okay? So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get into the intelligent design issues, the arguments, all of that kind of stuff. First and foremost is lack of scientific evidence and the scientific method. Okay? Second is the idea of what's called irreducible complexity, right? The third is that this whole thing of intelligent design is what's called an argument from ignorance, okay? Just like I did with evolution, I'm sort of going to go down the list, pop, 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 and I'm going to tell you all of the different things about this. First and foremost, lack of scientific evidence and testing ability. Like I said a couple videos ago, one of the issues with a scientific hypothesis and being scientifically testable is that something, first, it has to be observed, you have to hypothesize why it's happening, you have to be able to test it and interpret the results. The biggest problem with intelligent design is that third step. It is not testable. There is no way whatsoever that science can either prove or disprove the existence of God. Because remember, intelligent design is creationism wrapped up in a different package. Okay? There is no possible way that we can have an objective test for a higher power. We can't do it. Okay? There's nothing that said God does exist. I mean, well, obviously there's things that say God does exist, but there's no scientific evidence that says God exists, nor is there scientific evidence that says God does not exist. Okay? This is the biggest thing here. All right? Now, one of the things that sort of leads into my next one is that irreducible complexity was first described and shown by Michael Behe, right? And it was in his book, Darwin's Black Box. And this was essentially why evolution was wrong. Very similar to On Pandas and People, the other book that I mentioned earlier in one of my other videos. Okay? So he talked about irreducible complexity. Now, one of the interesting things is that he was one of the major witnesses at the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District trial back in 2005. And he happened to say something very important involving scientific research. I have, at great pains, taken this nice little folder and I have placed within this all of the peer-reviewed scientific evidence for intelligent design. Oh, look at that. It's empty. Because there isn't any peer-reviewed scientific evidence for intelligent design. Michael Behe said it himself at the trial under oath. He admitted that, quote, there are no peer-review articles by anyone advocating for intelligent design supported by pertinent experiments or calculations which provide detailed, rigorous accounts of how intelligent design of any biological system occurred. What more do you need? One of the biggest proponents for this system said there's no evidence for it. How can you say it's science when one of the biggest actual scientists involved in it said there's no science behind it? It doesn't make any sense. So one of the things about Michael Behe is that he is a professor of biochemistry, and he came up with this idea of irreducible complexity. Like I said, one of the biggest issues that has been pointed out with evolution is the idea of these complex systems and structures. Okay? So one of the analogies that Michael Behe gave was the mousetrap example. And essentially what it says is you have a mousetrap. It works as a mousetrap. The problem is it's nothing else if you take anything away. Makes sense, right? No, it doesn't. Because that's not how nature works. That's not how natural selection works. And that's not how evolution works. Okay? Even with this analogy, there were a bunch of different things that refuted it. Okay? The idea behind a lot of this evolution is that you start off with one thing that then evolves into something else. You don't just start off with a mousetrap. Instead, you start with something else that eventually becomes a mousetrap. For example, one guy, Kenneth Miller, he mentioned a couple of ways that this mousetrap thing didn't work. First, you could say that it was a spitball launcher. He said one of his classmates actually used a mousetrap as a spitball launcher by taking off the hammer. Okay? One of the other things is that you can use it as a tie clip because you can still have the spring and the bar that would hold a tie in place. You can make a keychain. You could make a clipboard. You could use it as a toothpick if you just take down that little hold down bar. Those were just some of the things that he mentioned. And that's the idea behind evolution, is that we start off with something that then eventually, over a very long period of time, becomes something else. Some of the things that Behe specifically mentioned were, first, the blood clotting cascade, second, the eye, which I already mentioned, and third, the flagella, right? So the blood clotting cascade, for those of you who don't know, is exactly what it sounds like. When you get a cut, a scrape, whatever it happens to be, it makes your blood coagulate and get all sticky and nasty. The problem is that in humans, if you remove a blood clotting factor, then you no longer have blood clotting. For example, I believe it's factor 7. If you don't have factor 7, then you have hemophilia. In other words, you just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding because you don't clot. Okay? That's essentially what Michael Behe is saying. But one of the interesting things about this is that there are many, many, many other mammals that have very similar blood clotting cascades to us, but they don't have the same mechanisms. They're missing certain proteins. For example, one of the factors that Michael Behe said was absolutely essential for the blood clotting cascade is not in whales. I know it's a little bit random, but it's true. Okay? Not only that, but if you think about, any other even lower mammals such as mice and rats, things like that, they also have blood clotting, but they do it in a different way. Okay? A lot of other fish, or not other fish, but a lot of fish such as jawless fish, they also only use 6 proteins instead of the 10 so-called essential ones. All right? This isn't to say that we're directly related to fish or vice versa. It just means that at some point, long ago, when the blood clotting system was first evolving, it went in 2 separate ways. We got 10 proteins, fish got 6, but they both work. Okay? So it's not irreducibly complex. Right? Second, like I said, was the eye, which I already talked about. And third is the flagella. For those of you who don't know, a flagella is the way that many bacteria, sperm, things like that move. If you look at it under a microscope, it looks like a long tail sticking out of a cell, okay? And it's made up of about 40 different proteins, okay? And Behe said, once again, if you get rid of one or more of these proteins, the entire flagella does not work, okay? Therefore, the engine is irreducibly complex. But one of the problems with this is something called the type 3 secretion system that is used in certain bacteria such as Salmonella and a nasty little bug known as Yersinia pestis. Okay? These are used to inject toxins from these bacteria into whatever hosts they happen to have. It's essentially a little needle that sticks out from the cell. Okay? This type 3 secretion system has been shown to have right about 10 of the proteins in common with the flagellum. One of the problems with this, however, is that the type 3 secretion system was evolved later on. But they do still have proteins in common with the flagellum. Okay? And in addition, flagella proteins have been deleted from genes or from the genome of various bacteria, and the flagella has still been able to function. Now, granted, activity is frequently reduced and all that kind of thing, but the flagella still works as a motor protein. It does what it's supposed to do. Irreducibly complex? No. Not only does it have things in common with other systems, but you can reduce it and it still works. So there you go. Last but certainly not least is that intelligent design by and large is what's known as an argument from ignorance. And essentially what this says is something similar to what's known as God in the gap. Okay? Which basically says there's certain things that science has as of yet not explained. For example, we still have missing links between us and chimps. Okay, some of these different evolutions like Australopithecus. Okay, we're still missing some of these. And what the God in the gap / the argument from ignorance is saying is that the fact that we have not found these means that they don't exist. Okay, that's basically what it is, right? The lack of evidence for evolution is proof for intelligent design. That's not true, though. Just think about it. Just because there's no evidence for it does not mean that it's not there. It just means we haven't found it yet. Okay? That's all it is. All right? But it makes sense because that's what religion has been used for years and years and years and years, thousands of years. Whatever people can't explain is very often explained by religion. Right? Take Norse gods, for example. Greek gods, whatever you want. Right? The Norse god Thor, one of my personal favorites. The god of thunder. When it was thundering and lightninging in Scandinavia, Thor was angry. We know that's not true. And if somebody said, "Oh, Thor's angry now," people would look at you and go, "What?" It doesn't make sense anymore. The Greeks had something similar with Zeus. If Zeus was angry, then he would hurl his lightning bolt. Same thing with Demeter, goddess of the harvest, right? The seasons came because her daughter was taken to Hades by the Lord of the Underworld, or by Hades to the Underworld, however you want your vernacular, okay? But no, that's not true. The way that seasons work is that we move a little bit closer and a little bit farther away from the sun, so it gets colder and hotter as we go, right? It doesn't make sense anymore. The whole idea of evolution versus intelligent design, in my opinion, is just another one of these little steps, wherein we say, this doesn't make sense. We haven't found the evidence for it, therefore it's God. End of story. Well, for now, that can make sense. But after a certain time, with a lot more work by good scientists doing real science and not filling up a bunch of folders with nothing, then maybe everybody will understand that science and the theory of evolution makes sense. And with that, I'll leave you. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again soon.
We start the story when Mom met Dad and they danced all night and he took her home. It might have been all the wine they had, but they rolled the dice and won your genome. Then you grew and you grew and one day you were you, and you look like your father and mother. If you're looking for someone convenient to blame, you can take your pick, it's one or the other. DNA, you're in my heart. DNA, in fact you're in every part of my body. Each cell has a nucleus, each nucleus has chromosomes. DNA, baby, that spells DNA. Guanine met cytosine, fell in love, and then thymine got busy with adenine. They sent the messenger RNA to the ribosome to make more protein. And while it's killing you dead, it will mess with your head, and it's the light in the dark that will guide you. It's the pages and pages of what you are like in the giant book that's hidden inside you. DNA.